The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. I remember because Tuesday was always the day Mom used to call me before Dad got home from work. A habit I'd noticed she'd abandoned somewhere around my 15th birthday. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, the kind with a weight that feels like consequence. It had no return address, only my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in 4 years. Grandma Eleanor's careful, deliberate cursive. My hands were shaking as I held it. Not dramatically shaking, the kind of tremor you feel from the inside, the kind that makes you question whether you're strong enough to know what's inside. I was 32 years old, standing in my tiny studio apartment in Portland, Oregon, with a career I'd built myself and a life I'd carefully constructed away from my family. And somehow that envelope made me feel like the 17-year-old girl again. The one who used to sit at the kitchen table with her notebook, trying to understand why being smart and kind and trying wasn't ever quite enough. I didn't open it that day. I placed it on my bedside table instead, and I looked at it every morning for a week before finding the courage. That probably sounds dramatic, but you have to understand, I'd spent 32 years learning not to ask questions. Asking questions in my family was dangerous. It marked you as difficult, ungrateful, emotional. It meant your father would give you that look. The one that said you were the problem. The one that made everyone else's shoulders tense up and suddenly become very busy with their phones or their dinner or anything that didn't involve looking at you. Let me back up. I need to tell you about who I come from, because understanding that is the only way you'll understand why an envelope from a dead grandmother could stop me in my tracks. My father, Richard Ashford, is the kind of man who commands a room the moment he walks in. Not because he's particularly charismatic or warm. He isn't. He commands rooms because he's learned that silence can be weaponized. He's learned that if you speak with absolute certainty about things, even things you don't know, people will believe you. He's learned that if you make someone feel small enough, they'll spend their whole life trying to prove they're not. I know this because I spent 25 years being that someone. My mother, Catherine, married him when she was 24 and he was 28. I've seen the wedding photos. She was radiant in them, genuinely happy. There's something heartbreaking about watching someone in a photograph be happy before they know what's coming. I don't say this out of bitterness anymore, not really. I say it because I've come to understand that my mother's life was a slow erosion of self, and watching it happen to her made me terrified of what might happen to me. My younger brother Michael was the golden child. Still is, in the way that matters to our father. Michael is ambitious in exactly the way Dad admires. Competitive, willing to cut corners, good at making himself the center of attention. Michael got into Stanford. Michael became a venture capitalist. Michael married a woman from a wealthy family. Michael is everything our father ever wanted to be reflected back at him. And my father has spent 30 years making sure Michael knows that he's the preferred child. Not in so many words, of course. Our family wasn't the kind to be that honest. It was all in the choices: which child got sent to the better schools, which child's accomplishments were bragged about to his colleagues, which child could make a mistake and it would be handled quietly, and which child's failures would become family lore. I was the other one. The girl who was too sensitive, too opinionated, too eager to please, and then too sullen when nothing she did pleased anyone. That's what my father used to tell people at dinner parties, casual and cutting, while I sat at the table. Sarah's always been a bit of a difficult personality. Very emotional. She never quite landed on the right trajectory. Meanwhile, Michael would be described as ambitious, for the exact same behavior. A temperament, not a personality flaw. A strength, not a weakness. Childhood with my father wasn't filled with obvious cruelty. There were no dramatic scenes, no screaming matches, no closed-fist moments. It was far more insidious than that. It was 1,000 small moments of being overlooked. It was asking him a question and watching him look through me like I hadn't spoken. It was bringing home a 97 on a test and hearing, "What was the 3 points?" It was crying in my room and my mother standing in the doorway, worried but helpless, because going against my father on matters of discipline meant becoming the target yourself. It was learning very early that my existence was an inconvenience to be managed rather than a child to be loved. When I was 8, I remember painting a watercolor landscape in art class. I was proud of it, genuinely proud. I brought it home and left it on the kitchen table, my heart doing that hopeful thing that children's hearts do. My father came home, saw it, glanced at it for approximately 3 seconds and said to my mother, "Didn't Sarah take lessons 2 years ago?" For something like this, the implication was clear. If I'd been taking lessons, why hadn't I improved more? Why was the execution still so amateur? Why was I still not good enough? He didn't say any of it. He didn't have to. His tone did all the work. That was the beginning of me learning to stay quiet. Not just about my accomplishments, but about myself. About my feelings. About the things that mattered to me. Because if I stayed quiet, maybe I'd be less of a disappointment. If I took up less space, maybe the disappointment would evaporate. By 13, I'd learned to anticipate what my father wanted to hear. I became skilled at reading his moods, at knowing which version of myself to present. On his good days, I could almost have a conversation with him. He'd ask about school, and I'd give him the answers he wanted, the achievements, the accolades, the things that made him look good by association. But on his bad days, and they were increasingly frequent, even my silence wasn't enough. My presence was the problem. My face. My tone. The way I breathed too loudly when he was on a phone call. My mother, I think, was trying to protect me by staying silent herself. But protection has a cost. The cost was that I learned my father's version of reality was the correct one, and that everyone I loved would ultimately choose maintaining his happiness over acknowledging my pain. My grandmother Eleanor lived 2 hours away in Portland, Dad's mother, and she was different. I remember being maybe 14, sitting in her living room on a Saturday afternoon. My parents had dropped me off while they went to some gala or another, the kind of event where children were inconvenient. Grandma Eleanor was in the kitchen making soup from scratch, the kind with real bones and hours of simmering, and she asked me about my week. Just like that. She didn't ask about my grades or my college prospects or anything that reflected on her. She asked what I cared about, what I was thinking about, what was bothering me. And I cried. I remember the shock of it, the way my body betrayed me and started shaking. How suddenly I was telling her things I hadn't told anyone. About how nothing I did was good enough. About how my father looked at me sometimes like he was disappointed by his own genetics. About how I felt like I was disappearing. She didn't minimize it. She didn't tell me I was being dramatic or that my father just showed his love differently. Or any of the 1,000 justifications that were being fed to me by everyone else. She listened. She made me tea. She told me something I'll never forget. Eleanor, she said. Yes, she called me Eleanor when it was serious, using my full name that I'd hated until that moment. Your father is a frightened man. Frightened men become controlling men. And controlling men can only feel safe when everyone around them is smaller than they are. But Eleanor, you were born to be large. You were born to take up space. And that terrifies him because it reflects back all the ways he's made himself small. I didn't understand it then. Not really. But I understood that someone in my family saw me as something other than a disappointment, and that changed something in me. From that moment, Grandma Eleanor became my refuge. I'd beg my parents to let me visit. I'd invent reasons, school projects, overdue library books, anything. My father found it odd but acceptable. Grandma was harmless. She was getting older. It was fine that I went sometimes. What he didn't understand was that in her home, I was becoming someone else. I was becoming myself. She'd play music with me. She'd teach me her recipes. She'd tell me stories about her life, about the things she'd accomplished before she married, about the choices she'd made, about the ways she'd learned to protect herself from people who tried to diminish her. She showed me her college degrees, her artwork, the photos of her when she was young and radical and alive. She showed me that a woman could be more than the role assigned to her. And crucially, she started taking me to a lawyer. Not in a dramatic way. Just matter of fact. Her friend David, who handled estate planning. She said she wanted me to understand how these things worked, how important it was to have documentation, to protect yourself through knowledge. At 16, 17, 18, I was learning about wills and trusts and how money moved through families. I was learning that things were documented, that there were records, that nothing happened in legal systems without a paper trail. I didn't understand why she was teaching me this. Not until the envelope arrived. High school I survived. Not thrived but survived. My father had made it clear that the family expectation was that I'd attend a state school and study business, something practical, something that would reflect well on him without me getting too ambitious and overshadowing Michael, who was bound for greater things. When I applied to Stanford Early Action, I didn't tell my parents. I funded the application fee myself with babysitting money, filled it out at school on a library computer, and had my guidance counselor keep it secret. I got in. The moment my acceptance letter arrived, I knew my life was about to become very difficult. And I was right. My father's initial reaction was something I'll never forget, because it was the moment I realized that his love for his children was conditional in the most devastating way. We were in the kitchen, and I'd just shown him the letter. For maybe 5 seconds his face was blank. Then it shifted into something darker than anger. It was contempt. "Well," he said, setting the letter down carefully like it was made of something disgusting, "I suppose you think you're going to go to California and get above yourself. That's very typical. Very typical of girls your age. You think getting into a fancy school means something. Doesn't. Stanford is full of girls like you. Pretty enough, smart enough, but nothing remarkable. You'll go there, you'll get distracted, you'll drop out to marry some rich kid, and then you'll realize you've wasted everyone's time and resources." My mother was in the kitchen, and she didn't say anything. She looked down at her coffee. "I'm not paying for it," he continued, and his voice was almost cheerful now, like he'd just solved a puzzle. "If you want to go to Stanford, you can pay for it. Let's see how long your confidence lasts when you realize how expensive it is. I'll pay for state." Your mother and I agreed. State school, business degree, like a sensible person. If you want something else, that's your decision. But I won't fund your rebellion. That was the ultimatum. State school or no money. Stanford cost more than my parents made in a year, and financial aid existed, yes, but not enough for a full ride, and he knew it. The cruelty was elegant in its precision. He was giving me the freedom to choose, while making sure that the choice I wanted would cost me everything. My mother finally spoke. "Richard, maybe we should just..." He looked at her like she'd slapped him. Not with anger, but with something worse, profound disappointment. And I watched her fold. Watched her make herself smaller. Watched her choose her marriage over her daughter's opportunity. "I'm going anyway," I said. The words came out very quietly, but they were steady. "This is important, so I want you to understand that I was not angry. I was not dramatic. I was calm, in the way that you become calm when you realize something fundamental about your place in the world." "Then you're ungrateful," my father said. "And you're on your own. As soon as you turn 18, you're legally an adult, and you won't be my responsibility anymore." He left the room. My mother followed him. I stood in the kitchen holding the most important piece of paper my 17-year-old self had ever been handed, and I made a decision. I was going to do it. I was going to go to Stanford. I was going to make sure I paid for it myself, and I was going to make sure I never had to ask for anything from him again. I've been thinking about this moment for 15 years, and I think it was when I died, in a way. The version of me that was trying to please him. That was hoping that one day I would do something right. That somehow, the love that should be automatic between a parent and child would suddenly materialize if I just excelled enough. So I worked. I worked through high school, saving every penny. I applied for scholarships and I got them. Academic scholarships, need-based scholarships, scholarships for first-generation college students. I worked 3 jobs my junior and senior year. I cut my own hair. I didn't go to prom. I didn't do anything that cost money that wasn't an investment in getting out. And when I graduated high school, I left. I went to Stanford and I funded it myself. My father was true to his word. I became his legal responsibilities end date. On my 18th birthday, he made it clear that I was welcome to live at home during breaks only if I paid rent. It was the financial equivalent of being thrown out, the kind of thing that looks reasonable on the surface if you don't look too closely at the cruelty underneath. But here's what he didn't understand. Losing him was the best thing that ever happened to me. At Stanford I thrived. Genuinely thrived. I discovered I was smart in ways that mattered, that my ideas had value, that my voice could fill a room without needing anyone's permission. I changed my major to economics and computer science, not because my father wanted it, but because I wanted it. I made friends who saw me, who liked me, who weren't keeping track of all the ways I was a disappointment. I graduated cum laude. I got a job at a tech company in San Francisco. I made real money for the first time in my life. I moved into an apartment that was mine, where I made all the decisions, where no one was judging my presence or my voice or the way I breathed. My family watched this happen from a distance. My mother would occasionally call me, always sounding tired, always careful not to say anything that might offend my father if he overheard. Michael was too busy with his venture capital empire to care much about his underachieving sister. My father made it clear that my success was irrelevant to him. I'd made the choices I'd made, and he'd made his, and we were done. But Grandma Eleanor stayed in my life. She'd visit San Francisco, and we'd go to museums, and she'd make my favorite meals, and she'd tell me about her life and what she'd learned about protecting yourself. She was aging, I could see it, but there was a brightness to her that never dimmed. She was proud of me. She said it directly, without caveats or conditions. She was the only person in my family who ever said it like that. When I was 28, she had a stroke. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to slow her down. She recovered, but she was more frail after. I started visiting her more frequently. We'd sit in her living room, and she'd talk about getting her affairs in order. About legacy. About the things that mattered when you got to be her age. "Sarah," she said to me once, and again the full name, which meant serious, "I want you to know that my will has been updated. Everything is set aside for you. The house, my savings, all of it. And I want you to go see David about it. My lawyer. I've left instructions with him. You need to understand how it works before I'm gone, because your father will have questions, and you need to know your rights." "Grandma, you're fine," I said, because I was in denial. Because nobody wants to imagine their grandmother dying. "I'm 87, she said, matter of fact. "I've had a stroke. I'm not fine, and we both know it. I just want to make sure you're protected. Will you promise me?" Promised. Of course I promised. 6 months later, she had another stroke. This one was more serious. This one was the one that killed her. I remember the phone call. It was my mother, and she was crying. My father was in the background, and I could hear him being unnecessarily loud, making it about how this kind of thing is always traumatic. Inserting himself into his mother's death in the way he inserted himself into everything. I took a week off work. I went home for the first time in 2 years. The house was exactly as I remembered it, except smaller. Memory does this, it inflates space to match the magnitude of feeling. Grandma Eleanor's home had felt enormous to me as a child, safe and full of possibility. Now it just felt like an old house in Portland with too many memories packed into it. The funeral was small. My father gave a speech that was suspiciously vague. He'd never been particularly close to his mother, though he certainly appreciated all the financial stability she'd provided him. Michael didn't come. He was in Aspen for some venture capital summit. My mother cried softly throughout. And I sat there, and I felt the weight of the envelope that was waiting for me at home. After the funeral, my father pulled me aside. We were in the kitchen of Grandma Eleanor's house, which was now technically the scene of an estate. His energy had shifted. There was a focus to him that I recognized, the way he looked when there was something he wanted. "Sarah," he said, "we need to talk about your grandmother's estate. It'll probably end up being modest. Your grandmother wasn't as wealthy as some people assume. But there's the house, of course. And her savings. Your mother and I are thinking that we should probably list the house, sell it, and split whatever proceeds there are between you and Michael. Fair is fair." I looked at him. This was a man I'd stopped trying to understand years ago, and yet here he was, still surprising me with his ability to want things that didn't belong to him. "Grandma's will was very clear," I said. "I'm going to need to see it with a lawyer." Something flashed across his face. Irritation. "Your grandmother's will is a family matter. We don't need lawyers." "Actually," I said, and my voice was so calm that it shocked even me, "we do." I called David, the lawyer, the next morning. He asked me to come to his office. When I walked in, I realized that Grandma Eleanor had left me far more than just money. On his desk were 3 folders, each one thick with documentation. The first was her will, which was straightforward, everything to me. The house, her retirement savings, her investment accounts. All of it. It was approximately $1.2 million, which was a life-changing amount of money to me, though probably not what my father had hoped for. But that wasn't the important folder. The important folder was labeled, Family Documentation. "Your grandmother asked me to hold this for you," David explained, sliding the folder across the desk. "She was very specific that you read it alone, that you understand it, and that you consult with me before sharing it with your father. She anticipated that there might be complications." I opened the folder. Inside were decades of documents. Bank statements. transaction records, photographs of real estate, a detailed letter from my grandmother handwritten, explaining what I was looking at. And as I read through them, the full scope of what my father had done, what he'd been doing for 40 years, became clear. Let me be very direct about this. My father had been systematically defrauding his mother. It had started small in the 1990s. My grandmother had given him power of attorney to help manage her finances while she had a brief illness. He'd never given it back. Over the subsequent 20 years, he'd transferred property from her name to his. He'd cashed out investment accounts and routed the money through accounts he controlled. He'd taken out lines of credit against the house. He'd even taken out a mortgage on the house that she'd owned free and clear. The documentation was meticulous. My grandmother, who had been secretly consulting with her lawyer for years, had documented everything. Every transaction, every statement, every contradiction between what my father had told her and what had actually happened. There were even photographs of documents he'd forged, her signature on transfer papers, her authorization for loans she'd never taken out. And underneath all the documentation there was her letter. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. She always called me by my full name. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. Sorry that the final gift I'm able to give you is the truth about your father, which is painful and complicated and something you didn't ask for. But I need you to understand something. What I've documented here is not just financial fraud. It's a pattern. Your father has always taken what he wanted without permission, and then gaslit the world into thinking it was his right. He did it to me. He's done it to your mother. He's done it to you. I've kept these documents for a simple reason. I needed to know that when I was gone you would be protected. My lawyer David will help you decide what to do with this information. It's your choice. You can expose him, or you can stay quiet and simply protect your own inheritance. I've left the decision to you because you're the only person in this family who can make it rationally. But I want you to know that I see you. I've always seen you. I see the daughter who worked 3 jobs to pay for her own education. I see the woman who excelled despite a father who tried to minimize her. I see you, Eleanor, for who you actually are: brilliant, capable, and far stronger than anyone gave you credit for. I'm proud of you. I've always been proud of you. And I'm leaving you this not because I want you to hurt your father, but because I want you to have the truth. Because a woman with the truth is free. All my love always, Grandma. I sat in that lawyer's office and I cried. Not the careful, controlled crying I'd learned to do growing up, but deep, body-racking sobs. For my grandmother. For the years she'd watched her son steal from her while she said nothing. For the love she'd given me in secret. The way she prepared me for a world that was far more complicated and dark than anyone had wanted to admit. What do? I asked David, once I'd gotten myself together. That, he said gently, is entirely up to you. But I'd recommend taking time to think about it. And whatever you decide, I'm here to help. I took the documents home. I read through them again more carefully this time. The scope of what my father had done was enormous. We're talking several $100,000. Money that belonged to his mother. Money that he'd systematically stolen, while her dementia had made her less able to keep track of financial details. Money that he'd been able to take because he'd positioned himself as the trusted financial manager. And as I read, I realized something else: he was still doing it. My mother had recently inherited money from her own mother, and according to documents my grandmother had collected, she'd stayed in touch with my mother's family. That money had similarly disappeared into accounts my father controlled. He was a thief, not just of money but of agency, of dignity, of the ability to know what was happening in your own life. I spent 2 years thinking about what to do. This is important, so I want you to really understand this. I didn't immediately run to expose my father out of some righteous desire for justice. I was angry, yes, but I was also afraid. Because this was my father. This was the person who had raised me, even if that raising had been conditional and withholding. And exposing him meant exposing myself to all of the consequences that came with that. I also had to think strategically. I had a career. I had a reputation. I had a life I'd built. Going public with accusations of fraud against my own father would mark me as a certain kind of person in people's minds. The kind of woman who was willing to air dirty laundry. The kind of daughter who turned on her family. Even if I was right, the social costs would be real. But here's what changed my mind. I realized that by staying silent, I was giving him permission. By sitting on this information, I was allowing him to continue the same pattern with my mother, with anyone who entered his sphere. In 2022, my mother had a cancer scare. It turned out to be benign, but during those weeks when she thought she might be dying, she asked to talk to me. She flew out to Portland. We sat in my apartment and she told me about her life, about how trapped she felt, about how she didn't have her own money, how everything she owned technically belonged to my father, how she was afraid of what would happen to her if anything happened to him. And I made a decision. Mom, I said, I need to show you something. I told her about the documents. I showed her the evidence of what my father had done to his own mother. I showed her the pattern. And I watched her face shift from shock to comprehension to something darker, recognition. He did the same thing to me, she said quietly. Didn't he? Yes, I said. I think he did. She cried then too. And we talked about what to do. And eventually, my mother agreed to file a complaint with the district attorney, to let the documentation stand as evidence, to finally say no to a man she'd been saying yes to for 35 years. The DA's office was interested. They opened an investigation. They subpoenaed bank records. They brought in a forensic accountant. And slowly, methodically, they built a case against my father for financial elder abuse and fraud. But before they acted, I had to make a choice about Michael. My brother and I hadn't been close since childhood, but when he found out that an investigation was opening into my father, he called me. He was angry. He wanted me to tell him I'd changed my mind, that I'd withdrawn my complaint, that I was going to bury this for the sake of the family name. You don't understand, he said, his voice shaking with rage. This is going to destroy Dad. It's going to destroy our family. Is that really what you want? Is making yourself feel righteous worth that? And I said something I'll never forget. I didn't destroy our family, Michael. My father did. I'm just finally calling it by its real name. He hasn't spoken to me since. The investigation took 18 months. It was long and painful and exhausting. My father hired a very expensive lawyer. He tried to claim he was simply helping his mother manage her finances. He tried to claim that she'd authorized everything, that I was misinterpreting documents, that this was all a personal vendetta. But the documentation was too clear. And eventually, the DA's office moved forward with charges. And here's where we get to the part that's actually relevant to the title of this story, where I stopped staying silent. My father, in his hubris, tried one final move. He scheduled a family gathering. It was Michael's 40th birthday party, at an upscale restaurant in San Francisco. My father had convinced my mother to attend. Michael, despite our conflict, had actually invited me. His wife had insisted apparently because she was tired of the drama. I almost didn't go. I almost stayed home and let my father have this one last moment of pretending everything was fine. But then I thought about my grandmother. About the way she'd given me the truth, not to hurt people but to protect them. And I decided that truth could exist in a room full of people if I was brave enough to speak it. I went to that party. I sat at a table with my brother and his wife and my parents and a handful of my father's colleagues. And somewhere between the appetizers and the entrees, my father started telling one of his stories. A story about how dedicated he'd been to his mother, how he'd sacrificed to take care of her finances while she was aging, how he'd saved her from poor financial decisions. And I stood up. The room got very quiet. My father looked at me like I was insane. That's not true, I said. My voice was calm. It was clear. It was the voice of someone who had nothing left to lose. And I think everyone here deserves to know the actual story. And I told them. Not with anger or drama. With evidence. I had brought copies of the documents, nothing classified or confidential, just the basic facts that the DA's office had already made clear they were pursuing. I passed them around the table. I explained systematically what my father had done, the money he'd taken, the trust he'd violated, the crimes he'd committed against his own mother. My mother started crying. My father's face went a very particular shade of red that I remembered from childhood. Michael looked like he wanted to murder me. His wife read through the documents with an expression of absolute horror. One of my father's colleagues, a man I'd never met before, looked up from the papers and said to my father, "Is this true?" My father tried to bluster, tried to claim it was all lies, tried to explain it away. But I was still standing, and I was still speaking. I stayed silent for years, I said, looking directly at my father. I stayed silent when you made me feel worthless. I stayed silent when you stole from your own mother. I stayed silent because I was afraid of you. But my grandmother wasn't silent. She documented everything. She protected me. And now I'm protecting my mother. And I'm protecting anyone else you might try to hurt. The party ended very quickly after that. The consequences were swift and real. The DA's office accelerated their charges once they realized my father was trying to manipulate the narrative publicly. He was indicted on 3 counts of elder fraud and financial abuse. His defense fell apart. And in the end, he took a plea deal, 5 years probation, mandatory restitution to his mother's estate, and his law license was revoked. It wasn't prison. I won't lie and tell you it was some dramatic comeuppance where justice was perfect and complete. But it was real. And it was public. And it meant that the truth finally was undeniable. My mother filed for divorce. It was messy and it was painful, but she did it. She had therapy, and she began the slow work of understanding the ways she'd been taught to accept unacceptable treatment. We talk every week now. It's not easy, there's a lot of history to work through. But we're building something real. Something based on truth instead of performance. Michael refused to acknowledge what had happened. As far as he was concerned, I was the villain in the story, the disloyal daughter who destroyed the family for a payoff. The fact that my inheritance didn't depend on any of this, that I would have inherited from grandma regardless, that I stood to gain nothing except the knowledge that my father faced consequences, didn't matter to him. He'd decided his narrative and he was sticking to it. I don't hear from him anymore, and honestly that's a relief. As for my father, the restitution was substantial. Half of Grandma Eleanor's estate went back to her, which meant it came to me through her will, but the principle mattered. He also had to repay my mother for the inheritance he'd managed for her. He had to sell the house he'd bought with money that wasn't his. He went from being a wealthy man with a comfortable retirement plan to being someone starting over at 67 with a felony on his record, and a community that knew exactly what he'd done. Do I feel bad about that? I've asked myself this many times, and the answer is complicated. I feel compassion for the fact that he's suffering because I'm not a sociopath. But I don't feel guilty about the truth. The truth is not cruelty. The truth is the only thing that could have set any of us free. What surprised me most was what happened after. Without the weight of trying to please my father, I changed. Not dramatically, but fundamentally. I stopped performing. I stopped anticipating what people needed me to be and just was. I took a job at a company that I genuinely loved, doing work that mattered to me. I ended a relationship with a man who was subtly controlling in ways that felt familiar. I made new friends. I went to therapy and did the long, slow work of understanding the ways my upbringing had shaped me. And crucially, I built a relationship with my mother that was actually honest. We both had to unlearn a lot. We had to learn how to talk to each other without the constant anxiety of my father's opinion. We had to learn that we could disagree, and that it didn't mean one of us was bad. We had to learn what real love looked like without conditions. My grandmother would have approved. I think that in a way this was her final gift to me, not the money, though the money is certainly important. But the knowledge that the truth told clearly and calmly has power. That you don't have to shout to be heard. That documentation matters. That protecting yourself through knowledge is not betrayal. It's survival. If you're still listening, I want you to understand something. Staying silent had a cost. Cost me years of my own life. Cost my mother her peace. It cost my grandmother her dignity. But speaking the truth also had a cost. Cost me my father. Cost me my brother. It cost me the version of my family that existed in my head before I knew what was really happening. The difference is that I can live with this cost. I can wake up in the morning and know that I'm not complicit in my own family's dysfunction. I can look myself in the mirror and know that I use the truth to protect people, not to hurt them. I can move forward without the constant anxiety that someday, someone would discover what my father had done and I'd be questioned for my silence. And that, it turns out, is worth everything. The documents told the truth. But I had to be brave enough to speak it.